you, Mike, for this invitation to introduce the work of my colleague and friend Bertrand Méheust, with whom I work on the steering committee of IMI, a private foundation studying parapsychology in Paris and in Japan, the French Space Agency's UAP study group based in Toulouse. Bertrand's birth on July 12, 1947, almost coincides with the birth of a flying saucer era. At the age of 7, he was captivated by this enigma. A few years later, he was devouring books and articles on the subject, doing field work while reading the great works of science fiction. This interest led him to study literature and philosophy at the University of Burgundy, but he did not discover his vocation as a writer until a few years later. Then, a philosophy teacher, he worked relentlessly in his spare time on his two favorite subjects, exploring the detailed and surprising links between pre-war European and American science fiction and post-war flying saucers. The result is a very original book, Science Fiction and Flying Saucers, published by a well-known publishing house in 1978, thanks to our common friend Aimé Michel, an exceptional mind and one of the founding fathers of ufology. The second phase of Bertrand's work began shortly afterwards in the wake of Aimé Michel's book on the physical phenomena of mysticism. For 15 years, he studied the history of mesmerism, the discovery of the unconscious, and the birth of psychical research from the end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 20th. This was the subject of the doctoral thesis he defended at the Sorbonne in 1997 and published 2 years later. A fate to the contrary, unless it was salutary maybe, prevented him from pursuing an academic career, but not from documenting in several other books the significance of these anomalous cognitive phenomena. His latest 2 books continue this quest. In Jesus, Miracle Maker, he explores the contribution of parapsychology to our understanding of the man Jesus and his miracles, a subject surprisingly neglected by the countless books on the origins of Christianity. The other, Proust Clairvoyant, in 2022, to mark the centenary of Marcel Proust's death, reveals both Proust's exceptional powers of perception and the influence of psychic research on his novel In Search of Lost Time, as well as the range of Bertrand's interests. Let's turn to his talk today. It is part of a third phase of his work, that of a confirmed author who returns to the intuitions of his youth. I leave it to him to explain the title, UFOs and the Problem of Elusiveness, whose subtitle could be Flying Saucers and Parapsychology. His factual approach is not intended to discourage the application of the usual methods of natural sciences to the study of UAPs. As a scientist, I would be sorry to support such an opinion. But in my understanding, his conclusions suggest that the traditional scientific approach is necessary but not sufficient in the study of UAPs. It will gain in realism and effectiveness by including, or at least not excluding a priori, a broader approach, taking into account the fact that the world is apparently psychophysical, not purely physical, with interesting consequences developed by thinkers of the past like William James and Henry Bergson, and of the present time like Harald Epenspacher. Now, I let him speak.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, for your presentation. Well, I will try to explain my title. I'll try to explain my title. My title concerns the idea of elusiveness, which is for me the signature of the UFOs, the deepest thing we know about them. And I try to show exactly what it means. So I start with a few preliminary remarks. And the first question is breaking with the engineer's paradigm. It's a sort of program I propose. In this paper, I intend to sketch out a phenomenological-like approach whose first task will be to abandon all current presuppositions about the nature of the UFO phenomenon. For this reason, I begin by attempting to shed the engineer's paradigm that has so far guided ufological research with scientific pretensions. UFOs are apprehended as material objects tracing trajectories in space, and the only boldness permitted when examining their behavior is to identify the anomalies in relation to the laws of physics, lightning acceleration, sharp turns, instantaneous translation, and so on. Similarly, the analysis of eyewitnesses' accounts and the psychology of witnesses often remains dependent on an engineer's psychology, between brackets, and on a conception of perception centered on the study of its distortions, which tries to stick as closely as possible to this physicalist approach and which remains basically, as a result, under the domination of physics. This is, one might say, a simplified psychology, cleansed of all the dimensions of the psyche revealed by depth psychologies and by the psychic sciences, which emerge above all in close encounters cases and abductions. Finally, extending its trajectory, the engineer's paradigm leads to that of the astronomer, to the question of life in space, to the possibility of interstellar travel. In short, for mainstream science, whether to reject or accept them, it must be stressed there is for the moment no other way of thinking about UFOs. However, this paradigm clearly fails to accommodate the strangest forms of the phenomenon, such as those observed in close encounters and abductions, which the engineer's paradigm mutilates or, more often than not, simply ignores. To leave it behind and to shed all the presupposition it conveys, I propose to change my software. To this end, I shall proceed in two stages. First, I try to stick to the strangeness of UFO phenomenon. I try to get inside its logic in order to penetrate it better, like an insect boring its way through its gallery. Secondly, by extending ufology to the research now being carried out for over a century and a half by theorists in the psychic sciences, I will sketch out a new alliance with this field of research, leading me to propose some hypotheses for reflection. If I state at the outset that my approach is phenomenological-like, d'allure phénoménologique, we say in French, is to restrict its claims. In the sciences and in discovery in general, what is fascinating at the early stage, the moment where the mind begins to bite into reality naked, without tools, just through observation, the five senses, reasoning, and intuition. I'm thinking, for example, of the reasoning that enabled Buffon to tear himself away from biblical chronology and be the first to glimpse cosmic duration. Then, once the science has been established, once the language, methods, and tools have been created, it becomes a matter for technicians. UFO are one of the few areas where we can still enjoy the exceptional situation of the early days. But at the same time, they remain a hopelessly confused and elusive object. And this is why it seems to me that ufological reflection must necessarily pass through a phase of phenomenological allure to clarify its object and its approach. This is a path I ventured down in 75 in an almost totally instinctive way, because I didn't then have, I must say, a very clear idea of what phenomenology is. Today, I'm trying to retrace my steps and refine my approach. I come back to the intuition of my youth, as Jean-Pierre said. Two facts force us to be modest here: the extreme difficulty of our subject and the limits of the phenomenological approach itself, which sooner or later, as the history of philosophy shows, always ends up, at one point or another, reintroducing the presupposition it intended to bracket. It would be astonishing if I were to escape this fate altogether. I describe the beginning of an improvised phenomenologist. I don't want to waste my time allotted to me telling you about my background, but I must tell you enough so that you understand how and in what context the ideas I'm about to present came to me. Between the age of 18 and 28, while studying literature and philosophy, I was carried away by two passions: science fiction and flying saucers. I was active in both areas, building relationships with researchers and authors, some of them who became friends. Seen from the USA, this may seem a normal and appropriate behavior, but that is forgetting the climate of the time and the elitism that often marks French culture. After the events of May 68, which had a profound impact on French society, the status of science fiction has changed. It is now perceived as avant-garde literature, and all the old SF, the kind I've used to support the thesis of my first book, is relegated to the infancy of the genre. As for sorcerism, in the prevailing pseudo-Marxist climate of the time, it is stigmatized as an alienated belief, attracting only sarcasm and disdain. On its side, the ufologist elite, dominating by the stature of Aimé Michel, perceives mainstream pseudo-Marxist thinking as cut off from cosmic reality and thus incapable of addressing the issues raised by UFOs. As a result, the two circles ignore and despise each other. Now, having had the intuition since my final year of high school after reading Aimé Michel that there is something very important behind the UFO dossier, I didn't share this disdain at all. Having a foot in both circles, I'm a kind of double agent at the time, which puts me in the position of establishing new connections between two files separated by prejudice. My first book, Science Fiction and Flying Saucers, Sous Couvre et Folklore in French, published in 78, will be a double transgression from his point of view, which partly explains its unexpected success, but also the misunderstandings it sometimes provoked. In the spring of 75, I am meditating on this book, still in gestation. The idea of a connection with science fiction is already clear in my mind, but another intuition is beginning to nag at me, which I'm trying to combine with the first, and it is this idea that I try to describe to you now. One side of me wants to believe in the material reality of the stories that circulate in the magazines, but another is already beginning to be wary of the slippery slope as the discovery of the SF factor, science fiction factor, that is the fact that most of the UFO stories seem to be inspired from old science fiction novels. Now, the SF factor encourages me not to take these stories at face value. Already aware of the evanescent nature of UFO manifestation, I decide to suspend my judgment of their nature and origin, retaining only what I can legitimately hold to be certain. I do not know whether they are fantasies or material realities, whether their origin is human, taken in the broadest sense, implying, if need be, the Jungian idea of a collective unconscious, or extra-human, whether or not they are collections of myths misunderstandings or hoaxes, whether they belong to the social science, meteorology, folklore, or atmospheric physics, and so on. On the other hand, I am totally certain of the reality of the reports, and I set about analyzing them, looking both about regularities and singularities. As I'm constantly immersed in case stories, I already have hundreds of accounts in my head, and the elusive nature of the alleged phenomena has not escaped me. But I have not yet meditating on all the consequences of this strange property. Then the idea suddenly occurs to me to consider it as a central phenomenon. For several months, I tried to find cases in which it could be avoided, but this task soon seemed futile. Futile in French. I might as well spend my time dropping objects to see if by chance one of them could escape gravity. It seems to me, moreover, that elusiveness affects only aspects of the manifestation. Every aspect of the manifestation. The place where UFO appear, their size, the duration of sightings, the number of witnesses, the alleged adventures, the behavior of humanoids in close encounters and abduction, and so on. All in all, it's as if a restraint prevents the manifestation from exceeding a certain threshold. So I decide to look at the UFOs in reverse and ask myself what would happen if this restraint ceased and the manifestation were allowed to go to the extremes. In this way, I try to specify and imagine the forms that UFO never take, and above all, cannot take in a way I'm trying to sketch their hollow mold. Here's an example. In the 70s, a new and particularly revealing scenario emerged, the famous UFO breakdowns. These breakdowns could last long enough, but never long enough for the police to arrive on the scene. If the whole impunity, as I put it at that time, was 1 hour, the spectacles of the repair could last 55 minutes. But if the sighting took place in an isolated area, as it happened, it could last several hours or even part of the night. Clearly, if the crew had failed to report the UFO, we would no longer live in the same world. Generalizing this thought, I examined the file from every angle, only to discover the same logic everywhere. There could be no exception, because if the control system, to use Jacques Vallée's expression, that seems to regulate the events had failed just once, society would have exploded. This assertion could not tolerate the slightest exception. I thus had, if not a law, at least an absolute regularity, which made it possible to predict not what the phenomenon would do, but what it would not do, the form it would never take, the adventures into which it would never venture. In June 75, I condensed these ideas into a 20-page text, which I sent to a few ufologists friends of mine without much response. Then I mislaid the text, of which, of course, I had not kept a copy, but the idea of elusiveness was to remain with me, since in Science Fiction and Flying Saucer, which was published 2 years later, I tried, though I think today I did not succeed completely, to combine it with the theme of the SF factor. Recently, ufologist Pierre Lagrange, a friend of mine, found this text through a combination of circumstances that could only be described as synchronicity. So, caught up by my past, I decided to go back to my original intuition and try to explore it further. Now, I'm going to try to invite you for a brief journey to the art of elusivity. The main point, the first one, is the theatrical coupling of ostentation and evasion. En français, l'ostentation et l'esquive. Esquive, we say in French. Let us get straight to the point. What the UFO dossier shows is a seamless case-by-case coupling of ostentation and evasion. What I have called elusivity, inventing without knowing it a word that did not exist yet in French, is not just the final evasion, but this strange coupling which involve all manifestation of the phenomenon and which concerned as much and without possible exception, for the reason I have just given, the close cases of a strangeness as well as the objects seen at a distance in the sky, and sometimes filmed in recent US Navy revelations are to be believed. For almost 80 years, a mass of data has been collected on UFO sightings, and all of it converge on this diagnosis. Always, everywhere, the phenomenon shows itself only to better evade itself, and it evades or erases itself at the critical moment when it will have to assume the fatal consequences of its display, leaving the indisputable proof which would suddenly tip humanity into another age. The spontaneous theatricality characteristic of close encounters, particularly striking in abduction reports, with the powerful and spectacular luminous manifestation with which they inaugurate and underline their intrusion, will inexorably abolish itself in the absolute opposite in the night of evasion. In the early 80s, I exchanged views on this subject with an American researcher, Martin Kottmeyer, who had reacted to my first book and who was fascinated by this elusive theatricality. I'm going to try and show that we are dealing here with a fundamental psychic knot which provides the signature of UFOs. This intention of monstration between brackets is clearly revealed when all cases are brought together and compared in order to study them in detail. For example, French researcher Eric Zurcher wrote a book on French encounters. It's a result of 40 years of investigation, and it clearly shows that this monstration, the spontaneous theatricality, which draws its material from the imagery of pre-Arnoldian SF, before 47, that is, and more particularly from the covers of pre-war American pulps, is a constant feature of most reports, right from the beginning of the phenomenon in the early 50s. What occurs most frequently is what I called in 78 in science fiction and flying saucer, l'effet vitrine, in English, the shop windows effect or the showcase effect. A kind of private show giving to a witness or to a group of witnesses, because contrary to what is often imagined, Zurcher also shows that the percentage of these private shows, in the order of 30%, I believe, have 2 or 3 witnesses. This is repeated in dozens of unrelated cases, at least in the early years. It must be stressed here that before the French wave of 1954, the investigation of close encounters was still in limbo and publications were rare. These cases have sometimes been unearthed by an archaeological investigation. They were totally confidential at the time and remained so for a long time, as there was no internet to connect everyone permanently as there is today. This argument would be unusable for recent cases, but it still works for the early 50s, with the caveat, of course, that only a near miracle could bring us the pure case where this monstration would give itself to us without having passed through the prior filter or retroactive interpretation. How could all these witnesses, without having been able to consult each other, have fantasized or invented, if we want them to be deliberate lies, these scenes based on the specific imagery of staging, ostentation, and noli me tangere, look but don't come near, don't touch. How is it that the first abduction stories appeared spontaneously, without any link between their witnesses, since the investigators, frightened by the bizarre nature of these stories, kept them and only published them later? In view of these facts, It seems reasonable to me to hypothesize that this theatricality is not, as skeptics would have it, the result of a projection by the observer, or more profoundly, a secondary projective elaboration produced by the investigative device, dispositif de l'enquête, we would say in French, but that is inherent to the phenomenon itself, in short, that it constitutes its signature. An example from parapsychology will make the point clearer. Skeptics have long tried to reduce the stigmata of saints to projections of belief. But today we know for certain that they are real and that they emanate from internal processes that are still incomprehensible. As the late Dr. Chertok proved in the 80s, much to the chagrin of the psychoanalytic vulgate. I'm going to apply a similar line of reasoning to the question of UFOs. So I come back to another distinction which is very important for me, is the one between weak elusiveness and strong elusiveness. When we examine the issue from this angle, we are led to distinguish two levels of elusivity corresponding to its two possible interpretations. First, weak or false or indirect elusivity is that conceived by skeptics. The UFO dossier, in their eyes, is nothing more than a collection of phantasmagorias. In other words, there are simply no UFO, and the UFO phenomenon is nothing more than an immense collective illusion. In this case, the elusiveness of UFOs would be projective. We would be attributing to an imaginary phenomenon an intention to evade us, whereas it would simply be born of our constant and inevitable failure to grasp the ghost we imagine. Here we come up against a thesis that necessarily springs to mind, namely that the myth of elusiveness is a spontaneous creation of the fabulous function, la fonction, comment dit-on en français, la fonction, peu importe. A mirage that mankind cultivates in order to enjoy the mystery while managing not to deflower it. In many tales of fantastic folklore, we sense this dramatic spring at work, and the question is whether it is only this spring that is at work in UFO cases. There is inevitably some truth in this thesis, and we could even add to it by arguing that skeptics, through their systematic denial, contribute to elusivity, and that these two levels can and should work together. It is worth noting, since we have taken the dream as an example, that this skeptical stance, however far we push it, cannot abolish the reality of the dream as an original psychic process. What we are primarily interested in here is establishing the irrefutable reality of the UFO dream, between brackets, welcoming its singularity and exploring its implications. The dream analogy can indeed be transposed to UFO manifestations, but with caution, for while the latter are elusive, as elusive as the dream stricto sensu, they also present a host of differences with the latter that preclude such assimilation. In Close Encounters, and all the more so in Abduction, the UFO dream, if we are to decide to call it that, cannot be assimilated to the stricto sensu dream for a number of reasons, the most obvious being that the dream manifests itself during nocturnal sleep. We could, as I tried to do in one of my books, propose the hypothesis of spontaneous trance states that have not yet been catalogued and that manifest themselves by breaking into the vigilant consciousness. But this hypothesis would run up against the same objection as the dream, that is, the abnormal restraint of the manifestation. The second level of elusivity would be strong or true elusivity. This is the concept I'm trying to define here and which I'm attempting to hypothesize. True elusivity would not be projective and would belong to the phenomenon under consideration as a revelation of its profound nature. From a negative characteristic, it would become, for the analyst, a positive property, the signature of a real and original phenomenon. We get closer to this idea when, by dint of scrutinizing the reports, we come to realize that such perfect avoidance can hardly be the product of the fabulous function whose unrestrained deployment naturally leads to profusion and saturation. Let's take the example of the UFO breakdowns. The spontaneous fabulous function is obviously perfectly capable of inventing this kind of events. We can even postulate deep structures of the mind which maintain over time the dramatic spring. But the fabulous function, as we know it, can't control itself. It can't foresee the holes of impunity, it's my expression, that will enable it to insert itself seamlessly into the fabric of human events, unless we lend it the power of self-surveillance and control. Let me come back to this essential idea. It will be objected that cases of UFO breakdowns are too rare to draw any general conclusion from them. It's a fact, and so, to answer this objection, we can rely on the repetitive structure of the classic road incident. A motorist sees a luminous object descend from the sky into which he is about to be abducted. It's a fact, however, that many abductees are astonished that at the moment of their abduction, the road, usually congested at this hour, was deserted. Everything seems to be happening as if the intruder had taken advantage of a bubble of tranquility, in short, as if he knew in advance the holes of impunity. Alors, what supports this paradoxical idea of true elusiveness? What leads us to doubt that the elusive manifestation of UFOs can be explained simply by the unbridled functioning of the fabulous function, or if we prefer, of the natural psyche, is among other factors, the fine-tuning of sources' testimonies to time, place, and circumstances, an adjustment that is statistically observable. We are not even talking about UFO cases here, but about UFO stories, the reality of which is indisputable. It's a proven fact that UFO stories don't exhibit certain shapes, size, or events, except within certain limits and under certain circumstances, and that this fact doesn't fit well with current psychological explanation. If these cases were only hoaxes, fantasies, or delusions in the usual sense of the word, we would have to observe a flowering of representation that would exceed the constraints of confidentiality demanded by elusivity and end up saturating all possibilities in the manner of SF stories, SF science fiction stories. For example, we would be hard-pressed to find a well-documented story describing the landing of a gigantic spaceship in a peri-urban area teeming with potential witnesses. From the point of view of elusiveness, however, the gap is perfectly predictable. The close encounter case needs discretion. It needs a suitable setting, a clearing, for example, where a pocket-sized craft can land. If we are dealing with delusions, it's hard to see why we would observe this statistically perceptible restriction on a global scale. Unless we assume that every witness is potentially an unconscious collaborator of elusivity and works unknowingly to adjust his fantasy and narrative to the required pattern of time and place, as if some kind of internal program were urging him to do so. But could it be that an internalized and implicit constraint achieves this collective result? This is not an insignificant hypothesis, and if we push it, it can go far beyond reductive skepticism. Skeptics will not fail to object that this saturating flowering of cases exists, but that it is eliminated by the investigating procedure, and that the answer lies in the dustbin of ufologists. I don't think it's there, or not enough of it, because if it were, the skeptics would have exhibited and commented on it long ago. We don't find that in the dustbins. This too perfect fit leads me to consider the research that would be needed to back it up. For example, if we were to build up a bank of UFO dreams, dreams in the strange sense of the word, in the strict sense of the word. We would find that a good proportion of these dreams could never be UFO cases because they would go beyond the strict bounds of elusivity. The threshold of passage to SF, an essential notion in my view on which I shall conclude, would be crossed. The only UFO dream I can remember, and I'm still amazed that I have only once dreamt about UFOs, involved an immense armada of multiform objects slowly descending towards the ground in the rising sun. It was a typical science fiction scene, like the majestic arrival of the aliens in Arthur Clarke Children's of Icarus. However, to my knowledge, no credible case of this kind has ever been reported. Most of the UFO dreams cited by Jung in his book A Modern Myth could not possibly be real UFOs. Je mean real UFO stories, UFO testimonies. In the reductionist hypothesis, what could be the psychological device that would frame UFO manifestation, imposing such a constraint on representation? And even if it were only a psychosocial mechanism, wouldn't it be interesting to exhibit and investigate? Here is a well-documented case in which we can observe the precision of this adjustment, with which we owe to the patient work of investigators from the Belgium COBEPS, one of Europe's leading research groups. At the beginning, 10 years ago, a young woman was driving through the shopping district of a small town near Liège. Night had fallen and the area was deserted. She spies a brightly lit triangular structure seemingly motionless just above a warehouse illuminated by 3 powerful spotlights. A route passes the edge of the warehouse. Seen up close, the object exceeds the dimension of the building above which it floats. The motorist hurriedly stopped just below the triangle at the edge of the warehouse and tried to photograph it with her cell phone. But in her haste, she forgets to roll down the window so that the flash is reflecting on the glass. Realizing her mistake, she lowers the car window. At that precise moment, the headlights begin to dim and fade, and the triangular object disappears in a matter of seconds, taking evasive maneuvers to avoid hitting the nearby power line. Frightened, she called her husband on her mobile, which provided the exact time of the incident. The traces left by her car on the ground also enabled the investigators who arrived at the scene as soon as possible to pinpoint the exact location where she had parked her car. According to her account, the luminous triangle that she saw leaving was floating above her, just above her. The Belgian investigator then realized that the surveillance camera of the shopping area may have captured the scene on film. They managed to get their hands on the data. Unluckily, the triangular object was parked precisely in the camera's privacy cache. In this case, if we play the skeptical scenario, we can assume that the motorist first thought she saw the luminous triangle and that the rest of her story is the unconscious cinema she played to herself in order to persist in her initial illusion. But then she was very lucky, because if the alleged UFO hadn't been on the blind spot of the camera, the film might have shown that there was nothing to see. The interminable empirical quest undertaken since Kenneth Arnold sighting risks getting lost in the sands if it is not guided by a guiding concept. To rule out the hypothesis that we are dealing with a set of interpreted natural phenomena, we must therefore, in my view, search the accumulated fact for the signature of intentionality, our quest must be that of the intentional think. The concept of strong or true elusivity, as I put it, enables us to answer this question and short-circuit the accumulation of data. This short-circuiting is given to us first and foremost by the way the phenomenon gives itself to us, by that unmistakable dosage of ostentation and evasion that constitutes its specific mark, the signature that distinguishes it from all phenomena given in the observation of nature, with a significant exception, as we will see, of the so-called paranormal manifestation. Through the infallible regulated interplay of ostentation and evasion, the UFO tears itself away from the blind processes of nature, demonstrating that it belongs to the realm of the psyche, taken here in an indeterminate, all-encompassing sense. It says nothing more about its nature, but it does say that. This admission, aveu in French, is veiled, condensed, and implicit because it has to be made to speak like an oracle. But in my views, it is of an immense importance for our research. So, reduced to its essence, then, the UFO signature is intentionality. I'm not using here the term in the very elaborate sense given to it by phenomenologists since Bretaño and Husserl, as we don't need to bother with such complication at the moment. To take the term in the common sense that everyone can understand. Everyone understands or senses that lenticular clouds, ball lightnings, brightly lit farmed machinery working at night, tie lantern, etc. In short, skeptics, usual suspects, do not manifest internal intentions, and that it is human who might project them onto this phenomena. The showcase effect now as an archetype of elusivity. Let's take this idea a step further. When we immerse ourselves in the phenomenology of UFOs, we come to realize that what UFO monstration seeks to stage is, in fact, the process of monstration itself. This is what we can deduce from the close-up cases from the early 50s studied by Zurcher. In an isolated location, an entity presumed to be extraterrestrial exhibits itself in a luminous transparent object, usually spherical or void, for one or more fascinated witnesses. Coming from another world and embedded in our own, so close to the witness that he or she could touch it, and yet inaccessible, it condenses all the motifs of future flying saucers stunting with their appearance, which is hard to distinguish from the illustration of close encounters that flourished on the covers of ufology magazine in the 70s. All in all, it is as if this effet vitrine had been designed as the optimum encapsulation of elusiveness. To support this idea, I would like to suggest a thought experiment. Parapsychologists use judge to assess the accuracy of clairvoyance description of masked targets presented to them. I think that if judges were presented with a collection of drawings from pulps published between 1925 and May 1947 and asked to choose the best visual summary of elusiveness, they would unhesitantly elect the icon of the effet vitrine. I discuss now about another point, intentionality, the living and physical nature. To find analogies or other beginnings, les amorces, I would say in French, of these combined processes of ostentation and evasion, we need to turn to the symbolic phenomena of the living world, both human and animal, in approaches to seduction, reproduction, power, and domination. For example, the partridge, faking to be wounded in order to distract the fox away from its brood, is already putting into practice the scenario of ostentation and evasion that stories of UFO breakdowns bring to perfection. And to take another example, that of birds. The song of birds is permeated by two contradictory injunctions, seduction and threat. Intentionality, taking in the simplified sense I'm giving it here, simplified but complicated in another sense, arises in the world with the living long before the human being, long before reflexive consciousness, from the dawn of life, and is already unambiguously manifest in higher animals. The flawless elusiveness of UFO first makes us think, with its ability to adjust to reality in its slightest variations, that we are dealing with a law of physics like gravity. Gravity, it should be remembered, was first thought of as an intention of nature, a law that never fails. Water, with absolute certainty, always finds its way to the sea. An initial analogy emerges. The elusiveness of UFOs would be to the collective psyche what gravity is to the material world. The final evasion would be as predictable as gravity itself. Thus, this analogy is both incomplete and misleading, for however hard the law of gravity may be, as Brassens sings, it remains silent. It can only be revealed through observation. It doesn't manifest itself in symbolic processes. It has to be meant to speak. The elusiveness of UFOs, on the other hand, always speaks first in the initial phase of menstruation to one or more human beings. Before erasing itself, it exhibits itself, sometimes theatrically. So, if what we are dealing with here is a system for regulating the psyche, it is of a different nature to a law of physics. It displays something more, as it seems to preserve in the material realm of the psyche, and therefore of meaning, the unfailing regulatory power of natural laws. Clearly, this is a novelty that's very difficult to think about. Another point now, the control system and the absolute overview, le survol absolu. This is a place to evoke Jacques Vallée's hypothesis of the control system, to which I have already alluded. The idea of suggestive, but its author has not managed to specify it, which makes discussion difficult. It all depends on what Vallée means. If he wants to say that the UFO's manifestation is a system for controlling the human mind, I think the dossier doesn't support that proposition. What the dossier does support, however, is that the manifestation seems to possess a power of absolute overing, in French, un pouvoir de survol absolu, enabling it to control itself. If my intuition is correct, we are faced with a paradox without equal, since the reason why we can know almost nothing about the manifestation of UFOs is precisely the most certain and important thing we can know about it. At first glance, then, it's a negative certainty. But it's a negative certainty that turns into a positive certainty when we consider the abnormal perfection of social elusiveness, a perfection that seems to tear away from known natural phenomena and elevate it to the rank of a fertile anomaly. What we can conclude from all this is that we have got the problem backwards. Elusivity has been seen up to now as an obstacle to progress in our knowledge of UFOs, whereas its inflexible rigor is a short circuit that reveals the essence of what we can know about them, namely the process of elusive menstruation. In essence, UFO manifestation is an oxymoron. It's a kind of summary of my topic. UFO manifestation is an oxymoron. An oxymoron is a typical creation of the mind. A presence that manifests itself by hiding itself cannot emanate from physical nature. We are therefore dealing with the manifestation of a psyche. People will object, and I'm sure they will, that the notion of psyche is vague and multiform. So, if possible, I should try to clarify my thinking on this point. In the first instance, my aim is not so much to clarify what UFOs are, but what they are not, by wresting them from a physicalist argument. The oxymoron argument seems to me to meet the first requirement. A psyche, then, but which kind of psyche? At first glance, the manifestation of UFOs seems to emanate from our own, or rather to rub shoulders with it. The material between brackets, used in close encounters cases and abduction is borrowed from the Western literature of the 19th and 20th centuries. And the dramatic spring of the manifestation, the regulated game of ostentation and evasion, takes us back to the oxymoron that has been at work in Greek thought since Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics. So, are UFOs a creation of the fabulous function? And if so, to what extent? And as I said, the fabulous function is perfectly capable of inventing this kind of scenario. What it is not capable of doing, as far as we know it, however, is exerting unfailing control over its planetary activity. It's as if it had the power absolute overflight, survol absolu, over itself. Absolute overflight is a philosophical concept and not just any concept. We owe it to Raymond Rouillet, my preferred French metaphysician, who dominated the philosophy of life in France in the second half of the 20th century. Gilles Deleuze, who was stingy with compliments, called this concept the most profound idea in the contemporary philosophy. For Rouillet, we distinguished between two levels of reality, first consciousness and second consciousness. Absolute hovering is a fundamental property of the first consciousness, the key to consciousness and life. Rouillet steered clear of parapsychology, but in an astonishing text, he acknowledged that paranormal phenomena, the existence of which he did not deny, could be characterized as a résurgence, in French he writes, une remontée, of processes from first consciousness into second consciousness. But he cautiously added that given the conceptual upheaval to which they lead, the time had not yet come to take them into account. Rouillet wrote this text more than half a century ago, and the time has perhaps come to make the connection with the question of elusivity. For it turns out that elusivity is inconceivable without absolute overview, and that this power is a prerogative of primary consciousness. Yet, the inevitable objection arises, how can we prove the reality of something that, by its very nature, can erase itself and always tend to erase itself? Is there not here an abysmal logical contradiction in this attempt? In reality, the phenomenon does not totally erase itself. Otherwise, it would also erase the memory traces in the mind of the witnesses, and we would not even be able to evoke its intrusion or even be aware of the problem. A new phenomenon recently observed and documented in France by researcher Kraspovich seems to show something of this order. Telephone calls from presumed deceased people addressed to relatives, which are sometimes abnormally erased from the memory of the telephones. But the evidence is too recent and too fragile to be of any use at the moment. On the other hand, even if these cases are real and stand up to scrutiny, the erasure is only partial, which supports my thesis. So there is bound to be a primer. The coupling of monstration and evasion presupposes an initial opening and a permanent adjustment of two contradictory processes. Without monstration, it couldn't bring his evasion into play, and without evasion, we would no longer be talking about the mystery of UFOs. The question would have entered the register of normal natural science. As in the meditation of Heraclitus the Obscure, the grandfather of philosophers, we are faced with a war of opposites that simultaneously call to and repel each other, mask each other, and bring each other to light. A minimum of monstration is needed to prime the pump, but not enough to create certainty. And in fact, the UFO phenomenon sometimes leaves material traces, often ambiguous and indirect, which may offer a foothold for investigation. For example, we can cautiously assume that the radar echoes and films recently unveiled by US Navy are real, and that these facts offer us something to be an extremely fragile hold, to be sure, as one sometimes gets the impression that the US military itself is participating in the game of ostentation and evasion. But at last, a foothold. I regularly discuss these issues with researcher Jean-Pierre Rospars, who is also an expert with the groupe d'études et d'information des phénomènes aérospatiaux, GEPAN. He insists that against the skeptics, meta-analysis should be able to test the hypothesis that something is showing up. This is the decisive point, which I shall now attempt to argue and develop using the Poltergeist case as a starting point. I must say, to introduce this point, that my real field of expertise now is not the UFO problem, which is a passion of my youth, but the problem, the history of psychical sciences. And derived, or what I'm going to say now, comes from my knowledge of this dossier. So I start with the poltergeist issue and its implication for ufological research. Continuing my project to detach myself from the engineer's paradigm, I will now relate the UFO dossier to that of paranormal phenomena, and more specifically to the significant phenomenon of poltergeists. Parapsychologists use this term to describe a series of manifestations generally, but not always, linked to the presence of a person, most often a disturbed teenager. In the home where it occurs, a poltergeist can affect objects, transforming them into projectiles, ransacking them, removing them, and making them reappear in a hermetical sealed room. It can burn metals, cause fires, stain walls with insulting inscription, make an oracular voice heard without any visible human source, and sometimes even cause an unbearable racket, as the German origin of the name, the verb poltern, to make noise, reminds us. In short, it seems to be the incomprehensible physical externalization of psychic tension, but its ability to evade investigation is as surprising as its physical inscription and tends in part to erase it. Those involved in its manifestation can sometimes see them unfold before their very eyes, especially in the initial phase of the surprise. But if an armed observer, in other words, a prepared mind, intend on catching them in the act, the phenomena will weaken and stop, only to resume as soon as the observer's back is turned or his attention slackens. This goes so far that it is almost impossible to film the manifestation of a poltergeist. It's as if an intelligent force is ensuring that they don't happen in broad daylight. An automatic device will rarely succeed in trapping them. The seemingly absolute logical problem mentioned above, how can one provide proof of something which by its very nature evades detection? This problem has, however, found the beginning of a solution with poltergeist. Their manifestations are known for certain, albeit indirectly, through the damage they leave behind, which in some cases has been documented by the gendarmerie. In France, we must say that as public order disturbances, poltergeists come under the jurisdiction of the gendarmerie. It must be stressed that these are well-documented facts based on a vast dossier on which all parapsychologists agree. Ufologists, alas, can show no such things. This ability to preempt and evade investigation has struck parapsychologists who have sought to theorize it. The German physicist Walter von Lukadu did just that in a text that left a lasting impression. His central thesis, drawn from information theory, is that poltergeist manifestations are part of a self-regulating system of the individual and collective psyche. Where popular consciousness once imagined the external intervention of spirits and demons, the German physicist postulates an immanent property of the human psyche revealed by the physical effects of psi. The originality of this solution is that, while preserving the materiality of facts, it shifts from transcendence to immanence. In so doing, it is part of the movement of modern thought. The title of this book, Geister sind auch nur Menschen, Spirits are also human, the hidden meaning of occult experiences, reflects this shift. The intentionality expressed in a poltergeist would be the expression of the actor's repressed desires, and the poltergeist, with its special effects, would be the observable expression of invisible psychic processes. While the material dimension of UFO is still under discussion, that of poltergeist, attested by testimonies dating back to antiquity and more than a century and a half of meticulous investigation, is now established as their modus operandi, their way of manifesting themselves. We can therefore affirm that their elusiveness is not projective. This is a very important point, central point. This reinforces the idea that the same could be true of UFOs. The commonality of register between the two manifestations is essentially due to the fact that they are animated with nuances and even important differences, that we'll comment on later, by that oxymoronic logic of ostentation evasion that seems to sign their intentionality and allow us to distinguish them from the blind processes of the physical world. We're indeed dealing with the same mode of donation. It therefore seems legitimate to draw on the best established manifestation to shed light on the most elusive, as long as there are common features inviting us to do so. As we shall see, these common features are sufficiently numerous to justify the parallel and provide food for thought. This is not to say that I equate the former with the latter, but I am proposing the hypothesis of family of phenomena with common traits, of which a UFO would be a contemporary modulation or emergence, and which would be governed to varying degrees by the logic of elusive monstration. It being understood, moreover, that the degree of thinking between the phenomena in question cannot be specified in our present state of knowledge and reflection. In supporting this hypothesis, I'm leaving behind the absolutely certain. Here we enter into the realm of speculation, but again, inintelligibility it affords seems to me to justify this risk. So I made now a comparison between the UFOs and the psychic manifestations. Levels of psyche, levels of elusivity. I'm going to take this analogy between the manifestation of UFOs and poltergeists with a step further in order to sketch out a differential diagnosis that will lead me to examine it from several angles. The level of psyche involved. While the manifestation of poltergeists can be described as psychic in the sense we have just described, they bring into play very different level of psyche, which is very important to distinguish from those involved in UFOs. Poltergeists, in their interference with concrete things, express instinctive dynamism, characteristic of what Freud called primary processes: bending, ransacking, derailing, provoking, frightening, setting fire to, defiling, and so on. Very rarely do they go beyond this primitive individual level. There are, however, exceptions. In the famous case of Le Monde Macon, the poltergeist, which attracted a large number of observers, rose to the level of culture, becoming a kind of sounding board for the heavy collective tensions of the time, marked by outbursts from the void, which greatly impressed the English philosopher and mathematician Boyle, who came to witness the phenomenon. On the other hand, in the case of close encounter abduction, UFO manifestation regularly rise to the level of culture and feature collective representation, largely drawn from the SF canon, which can, in my reading, be interpreted as quotation. Another point is the spontaneity of manifestations. Like poltergeist, UFO sightings are spontaneous. Exceptions, if there are any, are extremely rare. Some French researchers, such as Pierre Viroudy, made an effort in the early 80s to induce their apparition, but without any convincing results. in my opinion. Adorcism does not work with UFOs or poltergeists. You cannot summon them, you cannot force them to appear. Another difference is reproducibility, concerns reproducibility, semi-reproducibility, and non-reproducibility. From what has just been said, it follows that poltergeists and UFOs cannot be reproduced and observed under prepared experimental conditions. On the other hand, the great physical effect mediums such as Franek Kluski, Zapia Palladino, Uri Geller, Douglas Home, Ted Serios, etc., have demonstrated their ability to produce telekinetic phenomena under prepared and controlled conditions. But their power, while very real and duly noted, does not always work, which is enough to fuel the refusal of determinists. What is more, when they do produce phenomena, they are not necessarily those they have been asked to produce, and they never reproduce them identically. There remains something erratic, uncontrollable, and often ironic in the manifestation of their power. Moreover, there is a notable difference between the manifestation of material psi and those of intellectual psi. The former can be reproduced, but they are rarer, erratic, and difficult to control, whereas the latter, telepathy, precognition, and clairvoyance, while equally capricious, can be reproduced on demand, more regularly, and under better controlled conditions. With an Osowiecki or an Alexis Didier, an experimenter had every chance of seeing something interesting happen at almost every session. He could therefore prepare his test. It is these differences that largely explain the considerable lead that parapsychology and metapsychology have taken over ufology. Another point is the possible involvement of conscious and unconscious actors. In classical poltergeists, the physical phenomena observed seem more often to be linked to the presence of a person who is generally unaware of being the source of collaborating with this source, at least at the start of the manifestation. In experiments conducted with medium, these phenomena are also linked to the presence of a person, but who, on the contrary, intensely desires to produce them. In the case of UFO, on the other hand, this involvement is often than not to be absent. At first sight, close encounters and abduction are completely free of this link. It may be supposed in certain rare cases of close encounters, and especially in repeated abduction, but it is not observed in cases observed from a distance, even in most close encounters. Last point, levels of elusiveness. It follows from what has just been said that while the elusiveness of UFOs is almost absolute, that of psi phenomena is somewhat less so. Whether it is a matter of imperfection or intention on nature's part, the control device that regulates these processes loosens a little. It leaks. In mediumistic experiments, this leak allows the development of a scientific approach based on semi-repeatability, a state of affairs rich in consequences, but which determinism is reluctant to confront, and whose full implications have not yet been explored. There are several other developments which I cannot, it would be too long, and I come to my conclusion. It's about the threshold of the transition to SF. All this consideration bring me to an essential point. As soon as we admit the reality of so-called paranormal phenomena, in the general sense that I'm using here, which includes UFOs, we are obliged to set limits for them in our minds, to postulate constraints that will prevent them from exceeding a certain level. Thus, if generalized, the now proven power of fragmentary and veiled knowledge of the future would make human life, as we know it, impossible. If there were clairvoyants capable of blowing up the casino bank on a regular basis, this would be it. If clairvoyants regularly produce such effects, human society, as we know it, could not function. If the US military kept frozen humanoids' bodies in a secret base, the truth would have come out, the secrecy would have exploded, and human history would have begun to turn in this month of July 47. It is this critical point that I called in science fiction and flying saucer the threshold of passage to SF, le seuil de passage de la science-fiction. C'est-à-dire, that is, the threshold at which the ultimately untimely eruption of psi would destructure social life, the landing in front of the White House for UFOs, the complete vision of the future for clairvoyance, and for theology, a miracle of the resurrected Jesus in front of the Sanhedrin, gazon of the Temple Square. Grenand, the skeptic of skeptics, who in my opinion dreamed of psi without daring to admit it, demanded in his book on Jesus that the proponents of the resurrection provide him with this ultimate proof, which he clearly felt could not be provided. These are events which are never attested because they cannot have happened, but classic pre-Nordian SF, the kind of that nourish UFO stories, never cease to cross this threshold. Indeed, this was its essential dramatic springboard, for it is this transgression that ensures the temporal compression of events and the dramatic intensity of the stories. This is why, while it produced the imagery that would resurface in UFOs, it did not anticipate their elusiveness. It was not until decades later that elusiveness was reintroduced as a backdrop by certain authors. This was explicitly done by two SF science fiction writers of my acquaintance, Frenchman Michel Jury in Giant Eyes and Englishman Ian Watson in Miracle Visitors. For me, this argument has a predictive value, and I am taking the risk of rejecting a priori all the UFO crash mythology that has cluttered ufology since the early 80s, and which is currently making a comeback in the American revelations. The argument of the casino and the White House and all that it implies is compelling. It is the only argument of skeptics. It is the only argument the skeptics have. It is the only argument the skeptics have that really holds water. Most of their objections to the protocol, the possibility of faking, etc., to the non-repeatability are mere sophistry, even delaying tactics. But this argument is dominant and demands a response. And it's easy to see why certain minds prefer to deny UFOs and psi altogether, rather than have to face it to the consequences of their manifestation, that their manifestation logically entail on a sociological, scientific, and philosophical level, as soon as they are granted a certain reality. Indeed, as soon as we put our hand into the psi gear, we are led to postulate a control X that imprisons human life within a glass ceiling in order to make it possible. In this case, there can be no other solution. The history of the psychic science validates the X control axiom. When we look at the data, we see that the emergence of psi adjusts to a society's means of recording and its verification procedures. And we understand that it cannot exceed certain thresholds without threatening its structure. So in my opinion, elusivity is less about the non-reproducibility of psi than about the thresholds of intensity it can reach in a given time and place without threatening society. It allows us to retropredict what did not happen. It also makes it possible to analyze the historical variety of psi as a function of its parameter. It may have been more spectacular in the past, when means of control were weak or non-existent, and it will tend to weaken as they become more sophisticated. The archives confirm this prediction. Saint Joseph de Cupertino was able to levitate in front of hundreds of people in a cathedral in Roma, in a world where photography did not exist. Today, with smartphone, this is no longer possible. And so either the skeptic claim as the skeptics claim, there has never been any levitation or UFO, despite what the archives suggest, or we must join the parapsychologists in postulating the X control. And the logical conclusion of that, with the rise of technological means and the obsession with control that characterizes our society, Psi is destined to weaken and gradually die out, leaving mankind locked in its rationalist certainties without the otherworldliness that it still externalizes through Psi, which challenge and stimulate it. This is the prediction of Drew Lisenbud, one of the world's leading specialist in the psychic science, the investigator who, with his team, brought to light the power of Ted Serios, the greatest physical effect medium of the 20th century. The excess of protocols and precaution will ultimately kill the signal. Voilà, c'est fini.
Of course, I can't do this work justice. I am still, I think, digesting your text. So again, these reflections are simply, you know, very preliminary on my part. But thank you for this talk, for sharing this text with me earlier. It's a beautiful work of investigation, of the development of key concepts to help illuminate, I think, aspects of the phenomenon that that seem to manifest themselves, right? At least in the reports, and that's exactly what I want to simply focus on. I know you've responded to me on this point, but maybe I can get you to respond back. Where I'm critical of the text, and I will not review it. I will let it stand. Is in fact precisely at the level of method.
You already told me that, yes.
Yeah, the method that would allow us to form, the empirical basis for developing the concept of elusiveness, which is deployed, of course, masterfully in the text. The crucial passage for me, of course, is from the experience itself to the level of the narration of that experience, which we receive as a text in a way. And so this is a passage from experience to narrative. This is a dynamic, I think, that your thinking doesn't engage at this level, right? It engages at the level of the formed, the narrated description. And so the question, of course, there is a preliminary question, right? What are the dynamics of this operation, the movement, the passage from an experience, what Hynek called the UFO experience, to the narration of that experience? This is something, for example, that Greg Keegan, an American historian of the phenomenon, has recently sort of highlighted. And is it not important to have access to the witnesses themselves rather than their mere reports or recounting of an event as the fundamental material on which to build a picture of the empirical character of the experience? It is therefore important to note, I think, in this connection, that the presupposition perhaps here of a base of UFO reports rather than independent evidence of the UFO phenomenon itself, or the experiences as engaged at the first level by the theorist, for example, in the context of an interrogative interview. As Vallée, as Jacques Vallée himself often remarked, right, famously, we do not actually study the UFO. We study the reports of the UFO. And the distinction, I think, is crucial, right? Because there's the experience. If you want to engage, as you say, very beautifully, you engage in a phenomenological like analysis. But this is the point, perhaps, to focus on, which is that if we're not studying the experiences as a phenomenologist would, and we're only engaged in a phenomenological like analysis, then we're looking at the text of the report, not the experience itself. And therefore, my argument is that the conclusions that you want to derive by deploying the concept of elusiveness have to be therefore restricted by the boundary conditions set by this methodological approach, which is classic, of course, in ufology, which takes the report as the fundamental object of engagement and actually not the experience itself. So I'll stop there. This is my intervention.
The passage the passage of the narrative to the experience is a difficult point. Okay. In my response, I told you that first, there is no other way to do. I'm obliged to first study the reports. But I think it is possible first to observe certain regularities by looking carefully at the reports. It's my first idea. Of course, as I told you in my response, I use this idea because it's a way of pushing further the methodological doubt. That is, I didn't experience these experiences, and the only thing I have is the reports. The reports do exist. Yes, you follow me. The reports do exist. First point. The other thing I told you is that I'm very conscious of this difficulty, and what I try to do, I like to participate to investigations in order to get a closer contact with the experiences. But the experiences, we don't have them. We don't live them. We just can live them by meditating upon them. I'm clear. Am I clear?
Yeah. I mean, this is the fundamental problem, right? Which is that even in the psychical sciences, as you rightly point out, we have access to the human engagement or manifestation of these experiences such that, you know, I can at least in principle, like Stephen Braude, whom you mentioned, you can bring certain psychic mediums, for example, in some relatively controlled experimental conditions and observe, you know, very profoundly interesting phenomena in ways in which you can't do that with the UFO. So in a sense, it's an asymmetry, which you rightly note, right? The UFO itself, in relation to the person experiencing it, that dyadic relation cannot itself be subjected to any further investigation, so that all we have are the reports. Whereas, for example, in the psychical sciences, it's more advanced in a way in which you can bring the individual around which these phenomena circulate into some kind of a controlled situation, and where it's completely, in a sense, related to this individual, right? So there's two halves of the UFO phenomenon, whereas there's, in a sense, a central, you know, axis around which the psychic phenomena resolve, which you can actually bring under in certain circumstances, under controlled conditions. And I would argue there, and in not every case, of course, when you do impose the conditions, does the phenomena, you know, leave. You know, for example, Stephen Braude's study of the gold leaf lady, for example, her manifestations were under controlled conditions and did not. But of course, he worked tirelessly to make her feel comfortable. But anyway, so I think you see the
question: could an experiment be designed to test the science fiction factor hypothesis? For example, one might initiate a science fiction writing competition. The writing contest could solicit stories about UFOs that had some previously unreported unique characteristics, sort of a signal or behavior. One could then wait to see if the unique new characteristic or behavior is reported in real-world UFO sightings.
May I have the French translation?
Bonsoir, Monsieur Méheust, je serai votre traductrice pour ce soir. Donc, pour la question, Serait-il possible de créer une expérimentation avec l'écriture, avec le facteur science-fiction comme hypothèse? Par exemple,
Mais ça, j'ai compris. Continue. Oui, oui.
voilà, par exemple, quelqu'un pourrait initier une compétition d'écriture de science-fiction en sollicitant en sollicitant des caractéristiques uniques qui n'ont jamais été mentionnées dans les livres de science-fiction auparavant, et voir si, à la fin de cette compétition, ces caractéristiques commencent à réapparaître au niveau mondial dans les expériences vécues, dans les témoignages et le vécu du phénomène UFO. Lors des... Je ne sais pas si je m'exprime pas correctement.
Non, c'est l'idée qui est très difficile. Je n'arrive pas à me représenter comment pourrait fonctionner une telle expérience.
C'est-à-dire réunir un groupe d'écrivains qui écriraient sur le phénomène, qui écriraient un livre de science-fiction en utilisant des caractéristiques qui n'ont jamais été rapportées lors de manifestations ou lors d'expériences vécues dans le monde réel, et voir si ces nouvelles choses qui ont été décrites dans les livres commenceraient à apparaître dans les nouveaux rapports les nouveaux rapports qui arriveraient plus tard dans le monde réel.
Oui, je comprends. Je ne sais pas si on peut faire ça. Si vous voulez, le monde dans lequel nous vivons aujourd'hui n'a plus rien à voir avec le monde dans lequel les ovnis sont apparus. Vous voyez ce que je veux dire? Il y a une profusion d'informations telle que tout le monde est au courant de tout. Avec les smartphones, ça n'est plus possible. Vous voyez? Peut-être il aurait fallu faire ça dans les tout premiers temps, mais il fallait avoir l'idée, le concept pour pouvoir faire l'expérience. Maintenant, le monde est tel que je ne crois pas qu'on puisse faire une expérience de ce genre. Moi, personnellement, j'ai fait une expérience qui n'est pas exactement la même, mais j'étais ami d'un écrivain qui était le plus grand spécialiste de la science-fiction en France, peut-être même en Europe, Pierre Versin, qui avait la plus grande bibliothèque de science-fiction. Et quand j'ai eu mon intuition de comment fonctionnait l'imaginaire des ovnis par rapport à la science-fiction, j'ai établi une liste a priori des cas, des récits que j'allais trouver. J'ai établi une liste a priori des récits que j'allais trouver. Et j'allais chez Versin et je lui disais, par exemple, il me faut un cas où un rayon de lumière l'évite d'une voiture. Il me faut... je prenais les péripéties habituelles des rencontres approchées. Voilà. Et Pierre Versin, qui était très sceptique, ça l'amusait beaucoup parce qu'il allait me chercher les livres et il les empilait sur la table. Et j'en avais des piles comme ça. C'est-à-dire que je pense que j'avais capté cet imaginaire, je savais d'avance ce que j'allais trouver. Vous comprenez?
Oui.
Voilà.
Vous permettez que je traduise?
Oui, essayez de
Ça va être un peu trop long.
Only a summary, I suppose. We only have a few more minutes.
Summary. So
Right.
what he says is it's very difficult in the world today with all the smartphones and the technology, and also the amount of information that we have that's around the world that goes so fast, to create the kind of experiment that the person asked. What he did say is that when he had this intuition of his that brought on all his hypotheses, he went to see his friend, who is also a scientific author, but who also had the biggest collection probably in Europe at the time of science fiction writings. And he said to his friends, well, in relationship to what real encounters of the third kind would be, or real close encounters would be in real world, well, in your books, I need a car that's been taken up in a light beam. Would you find that in one of your books? And then his friend, which is a huge skeptic, it would make him laugh, and he would bring a pile yay high of books that he would put on his desk and say, "Here you are. Here they are right now." So he's saying that yes, the imaginary and the fiction and the reality are so sometimes close together that it's difficult to separate, and it's difficult to see what influences the other first.
Yeah.
Merci,
Okay,
très bien. Très bien.
Okay.
Hmm.
I'm going to call on Kimberly Engels. Kimberly, one of our colleagues at the Society.
I'm going to respond briefly to the point that Mike brought up about working with reports, because I think this is an important point. When you're working with a report, whether you're actually working with the witness or it's a written text, you're working phenomenologically with the pneumatic layer of memory. And memory is, as an intentionality, a reconstruction of the perception that's often infused with elements of imagination as well when it's reconstructed. So that's one of the reasons that you have to be careful with reports. However, there is ways to work with reports and filter out those aspects that may have been blended in with imagination, especially if an encounter is intersubjective and you have the perspectives of different witnesses, and that there is some kind of coherent picture or coherent account that emerges from the various perspectives. And then working with individual accounts also, when they reflect what's revealed in the intersubjective, can then at that level become more credible. I'm sorry, that was just a comment. A question for you: do you think that there is an extent that we can consider these in the modality of intersubjectivity? I couldn't quite follow that throughout your talk. Do you think that this is ultimately an experience of elusiveness that's emanating from the human psyche, or are you positing that there is an external consciousness that we are potentially interacting with?
I think this question cannot be solved. I use the word psyche in a very general sense, and it may include, for instance, collective unconscious or whatever you want. As I told in my text, the thing I wanted to say is what the UFOs are not. And they belong to the realm of psyche in a very general sense. But it's impossible now to make it clear, to precise the range, comment dit-on, le lien familial, the family link of the UFOs with our mind is impossible to precise. Est-ce que j'ai été clair? Le lien familial, on ne peut pas préciser le. Est-ce que la traductrice peut intervenir là?
Je vous écoute.
Bon. Je répète ce que j'ai dit à cette dame. Il est, comment dire, le lien, elle me demande si c'est l'esprit humain ou psychique, ou si c'est un esprit extérieur, extraterrestre, tout ce que l'on voudra. Je lui réponds que je ne peux pas le savoir. La seule chose que me dit l'élusivité, c'est que c'est un oxymore, et qu'un oxymore, c'est le domaine de l'esprit. You understand? Et donc, c'est-à-dire la rencontre de deux choses qui se contredisent absolument. La méditation sur les oxymores, c'est le début de la philosophie grecque, Héraclite, etc. Et donc, je n'essaie pas de résoudre cette question, j'essaie simplement de dire que l'élusivité, le caractère oxymoresque des manifestations des ovnis, permet de dire que nous n'avons pas affaire à un phénomène matériel, aveugle, mais je ne peux pas préciser le lien qu'il y a avec je ne sais pas si c'est un psychisme. Ça ne fonctionne pas, ce que je peux dire, ça ne fonctionne pas comme le psychisme humain habituel, car le psychisme humain habituel ne possède pas ce pouvoir d'autocontrôle, de survol absolu. Mais ce que je peux dire, c'est que ça appartient à une forme de psychisme. C'est ma conclusion, je peux me tromper, mais c'est ce que je pense. Est-ce que c'est clair?
Je vais tenter de retraduire tout
Mais
ceci.
vous faites très bien, vous faites très bien. Je suis sûr que vous
Merci.
allez arriver.
So what he's saying is that the only conclusion that he came through all his studies is that what the UAP phenomenon is not what it is. Regarding the psyche, the only thing he can say for sure is that it's not in the realm of human psyche as we know it. He cannot make a link between what's outside and what's in, what's from the human psyche and what's not. The only thing he can come to the conclusion is that there is this absolute control and this absolute elusiveness that is over the phenomenon, and therefore we cannot apprehend it in a normal human psychic way.
Yes, okay. Le fonctionnement psychique habituel.
It's not the
Ça ne
normal
permet pas
human psychic
d'expliquer ça.
function. You
Thank
have
you. Thank you. It's
something else.
I got it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah,
You got it.
thanks. Brian, we have to cut it. I'm sorry. But if you want to state your question and then we'll see. Go ahead.
J'essaie en français. J'essaie en français. Merci.
Alors, très bien, très bien.
Donc, merci beaucoup pour un discours très formidable, provocatif. J'ai une question très courte. C'est possible d'avoir une soucoupe volante sans observateur?
Une soucoupe volante sans observateur. Ouais. C'est quand j'étais enfant et que j'étais à l'école, je me disais, les objets là qui sont dans ma chambre quand je ne suis pas là, est-ce qu'ils existent?
Ouais.
Et j'étais pris de vertige. Je ne peux pas répondre à cette question. Il y a parfois des photos qui ont été faites de gens qui ont pris, sans le vouloir, des ovnis. On prétend que ce sont des photos d'ovnis. Ils voulaient photographier la famille et au-dessus, on voit un objet bizarre et c'est un ovni. Sauf que l'observateur, il est après, mais il y a un observateur. D'accord?
Plus pas. Mes oreilles sont comme les escargots, lentes à comprendre. J'ai besoin d'introduction si possible.
No problem. So he was saying that can UFOs be photographed? Can be seen without a witness? Well, he says even if you have these so-called non-witness pictures where you have somebody taking a picture of a family and you have this weird object in the sky, well, the witness is there. Even then.
Yeah.
Oui.
All right, I'm going to have to end. Bertrand, merci. Thank you. C'est magnifique.
Thank you for your invitation.
Of course, thank you for accepting, and we look forward to your paper to be received by the journal.
You wait for my paper?
We wait October. Yeah. But
in English.
If you can, yes.
Yes.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay.
Au revoir. Bonne nuit.
À bientôt.
Bonne nuit.
Bye bye.
Bonne nuit à vous.
Bonne nuit.